Hey folks, it's Bear Gardener, and the spoiler season for the new expansion Blood and Iron for cards is still rolling, and we have more than 20 cards that have dropped in the last week, so I'm going to go through those in a bit. As always, I am a Kards Content Creator, general fan and player of the game. I stream the game, I obviously place content up here. You can find all the links down below. You can also, if you feel the urge, hit the like, subscribe button, of course, here, which helps the algorithm feed those little algorithm beasts. I'm not quite sure how they work, but if you can keep feeding them, that would be good, because reach is important, and I'm not quite sure how that whole thing goes. Also, if you feel the urge, come join me on Twitch. Definitely give me a follow on there. If you want to support the channel and the content, you can sub via Twitch, or you can hit the link below to go to a coffee and pick and choose how much you'd like to support by. Every little helps. Obviously there are costs involved with this, but mostly I do this because it's a passion project for me, and because I enjoy the game, and talking about card games. Speaking of talking about card games, that's what this video is going to be. We're going to go through this week's reveals, and there have been a few. We're going to look at each of the individual cards and talk about what I think about them, as we have done before. You can find link down below. It's down there. There'll be a link to the playlist that this video is on, which covers all of my coverage of the Blood and Iron expansion and different responses to it. So everything that I think will go on there, from card reveals to the reveals I do myself, one of which will have already landed by the time you see this. I have done yet another special reveal, which will be in this video. The card will anyway. The reveal will be in the playlist down below. And all of that stuff, as well as like comments on dev blogs and that sort of thing. So, dev blogs, by the way, are the articles. The name Art 1939 gives you the articles that they post, including things like rotations and balance patches, which we're expecting too. So, without too much further ado, let's hop across and get into the first card. As usual, we're going to go alphabetically by main nation, and then we'll do the allied nations. So, as I said, alphabetically by main nation and not bias on my own native behalf, this is the first British card we have seen, and this is the Cheshire Regiment. And this card is potentially very good. So, on the face of it, this is a very, very indifferent card to include in your deck. But this goes to what the developers were talking about with regards to having Britain using mechanics that will kind of punish you for suboptimal attacks, or not attacking, or attacking in the wrong place, is the way they put it. I think of it more as putting a degree of pressure on your opponent to play a certain way. So this card pressurizes you as an opponent to play a certain way, and for its 2 cost, it's pretty decent. Obviously, with 5 health, it can hang around for a while, but the text, of course, is the heart of this limited card. The start of your turn, deal 2 damage to the enemy HQ if this unit was not attacked last turn. Note, attacked. Not damaged, not affected by an order. You can't just pink this with a sickle or anything like that. I don't think it would proc, actually. I'm curious, actually, to test the theory at some point as to whether a commando proc would work on it, but I don't think it would, because that's not actually an attack either. This is attacked in combat, so this thing is effectively a ticking time bomb. It's a clock that starts ticking as soon as it hits the board. Unless you deal with it, it will slowly burn down your HQ. More interestingly, of course, Britain is not short of ways to guard units. Note, this is not a guard. I talked in another video about some cards needing guard to make sure they are always targetable, because otherwise they'd be silly and broken. This card is not got guard, so it will not always be targetable. So you can drop this, you can cover it with your guards, and it will continue to tick and tick and tick until your opponent deals with your guards, gets through them, and attacks this. Also, Britain, not exactly short of ways to put extra health on units. So this is potentially something that might see play. Now, I don't know whether this is an archetype that we will see, but it's certainly interesting. This would be an interesting piece to put. It's kind of similar, in some ways, to the constant ticking effect of 327th Pathfinders in US frontline if Britain ends up with a similar kind of board position based deck, which looks possible in this expansion, in that this is going to be something that will sit on your backline and have a potent effect until your opponent finds a way to deal with it. And of course you can run 3 of these. If you can get 3 of these out, you're doing 6 damage a turn to your opponent's HQ, which is also not nothing. Do I think it's super strong? No, because it can't do anything else unless you find a way to buff it. But it's definitely an interesting card, and I'd certainly expect to see some people play around with it, particularly people who want to play slower tempo or like late tempo or control decks. Personally, I think it's pretty cool design space. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so this leads us neatly to the Cheshire Regiment's even more annoying big brother. This is the 70th Brigade, and actually this card might be a tiny bit cracked, in my opinion. So, once again, same deal. This is a heavy defense, low attack unit that does not have guard, that is really designed to be put down and punish your opponent for not dealing with it, while allowing you to use guards to cover it up so that your opponent can't deal with it. And this one has, at the start of your turn, draw a card and gain +2 HQ defense if this unit was not attacked this turn. Or last turn, I should say, in your opponent's last turn. That's bonkers! I want to be clear, the value on this is bonkers. So, for comparison, we can look at Convoy, which is 3 cost, draw 2 cards, and Fortification, which is 4 cost, 3 cost anyway, gain 7 HQ defense. Yes, this is a special, so you can only run 2 of them, but unless your opponent deals with this, the value on this is insane, and we're talking about an archetype where your opponent's going to have to prioritise. If this is on the board, and Cheshire Regiment is on the board, and you've got a couple of guards or something in the front line so that your opponent's got to find a way to get to them, your opponent is likely going to have to make the ogre's choice, which to deal with. Which can you deal with? Both, of course, are buffable, both, of course, are not particularly good units, so they are technically a tempo loss when you play them. They're not tools that are going to do anything for you except for their passive effect. But their passive effect is so good, and it's also important to note that in the last release, we, of course, saw Britain getting a guard that allows other guards to blitz. So this is building into the potential for a heavy body-based Britain deck that has passive effects, which will be slower than the traditional frontline or value decks that we're seeing at the minute, and therefore may not be as good, but has effects like this. Drawing a card and gaining 2 HQ defense every turn, if you can keep this thing covered, is just mad. Anyway, I want to be clear that I think this card is potentially cracked. I certainly expect to see some people play around with this who like the idea of playing longer games. I'm not going to lie, I've got some ideas. But yeah, again, it's interesting design space, might be a teeny bit strong, or at the very least a teeny bit cheap at 4. Okay, continuing in the vein of this new feel to Britain that I am detecting, we have the Black Prince. It's Eddie. Controversy about different tanks and service and all of that stuff to one side. Let's look at the value of this as a card in the game. This is a big elite. It's not particularly big because of its stats or its abilities or anything like that. It does have heavy armor, which is kind of nice, but the key to this is obviously the potency of the text, which is only 2 units can occupy the front line. Deployment, retreat all units in it. So when you deploy this, you push everything back from the front line, yours and your opponent's, and from that point onwards, as long as this thing is alive, there can only be 2 units in the front line at any given time. Now, I'm given to understand that covert units don't get, obviously, retreated, but will, I believe, count as units in the front line because they are a unit, they're just not affected by deployment effects or orders, but the actual text is neither of those things. So if your opponent has, say, a revealed covert unit and 2 covert units in the front line, then the revealed one will retreat, but the other 2 will stay there, and they would, until one or other of them is retreated or destroyed, your opponent can't get more into it. Obviously, this is going to be an absolute bane if it hits the board for a lot of fast, wide decks, because this stops being able to leverage stuff like that. This is a big hit to anything that's depending on something like, say, Blitzkrieg or Lotta to actually... Lottersvard, by the way, to actually make wide viable. So, do I think this card is good? Yes. Do I think this card is utterly amazing and going to utterly change the game? No, but I do think it might well see some play. Being able to, again, lean into this kind of board state and positional control idea for Britain is very new. The idea of having presence rather than either a really strong backline or just turtling up behind guards and using orders. This is all leaning towards a much more present Britain on the board, which I really like. I like the feel of it. I think it's interesting. I think it's the frustrating / incredibly annoying challenge of dealing with highly trained and tactically focused units, specifically infantry, but also occasionally armoured brigades, fits very well with the theme of what it was like to deal with the Brits in World War II. And I generally like the feel of it. How it all combines together could either end up being not quite a holistic deck or a little bit crazy with some of the cards, but we shall see. But overall, I actually like this as design. I think it's kind of fun and interesting. It's not world-breaking, because obviously it can be removed and destroyed like any elite, and it in itself is not egregious in its stats or abilities. It's just the text that is slightly terrifying. Okay, next British card is the Bloody 11th, the Devonshire Regiment, if anyone's wondering. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's accurate. And this is yet another kind of Britain value tool. This is a much more generic card. This card is not doing anything super fancy, but it's taking something we've seen in Britain before, which is gaining buffs when it survives combat, and applying it to an infantry regiment. This thing is very similar to other units that we've seen. We've obviously seen Schutzen, which is the special German regiment, but of course the difference with that and, say, Winter Regiment is they heal themselves, either by being veteran or because they have a text on it. This obviously doesn't heal itself when it survives combat, but it does have big stats, and even bigger ones if it can pick its combat effectively. Also, if you could find a way to, for example, give it shock, which would proc the combat survival and turn it into a 6/7, which is a big body. Now, of course, there are downsides. I mean, the upside, of course, is it's a standard card, so you can run a chunk of them. The downside, of course, is it doesn't have blitz. And I think this is interesting, actually, and fairly sensible. We're seeing an awful lot of Britain getting more kind of solid value units like this that could technically contest in a board presence way, but we're not seeing Britain get tons and tons and tons of blitz because they're going to have to do it a slower and more plodding way, and I actually quite like that. I think it makes it interesting. I think it makes it much more interesting than just kind of ending up with carbon copies of the already functional kind of US and German in particular value units that you can get forward. Now, the downside, of course, is that without blitz there is a hampering of this, but the upside is, as we mentioned with some of the earlier cards, the Brits are getting some really interesting passive effects from their units, which could be utterly devastating. So I am overall quite interested to see this archetype continue to develop, and I'm certainly interested to try it out. On the whole, I'm pretty okay with this card. I think it's just a decent value card. I don't think it's anything special in either direction. I think if it had a veteran text or something similar, if this was a veteran effect, it might be a bit cracked because it would heal itself. But because, largely speaking, you're going to have to trade with this to get the proc, or it's got to survive being attacked, it becomes a little clunkier to use, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm not necessarily sure this is going to proliferate anywhere. Also, there's an awful lot of 4-cost stuff floating around, and there's only so much you want to play in your 4-drop slot in a deck. But overall, I think it's quite a cool design, and I think works quite nicely for Britain. Okay, so we have arrived at Germany. And the first unit we're going to see is 62 Infantry Regiment. Actually, I'm moved to say I actually quite like the art on this card. It's weird, I've been slightly, I'm not going to lie, underwhelmed by some of the art in this expansion. There's a whole lot going on with that. But I actually quite like the composition of this piece. Anyway, it's not, again, you're not here for an art lecture, that's a different video. Let's talk about this just as it is, as the limited card that it is. This is a pretty decent value to drop, honestly, if you can make use of it. Like all things that have shock, part of you would love to see them have blitz, but part of me would really prefer not to see blitz too prominent with shock. Shock, of course, the new keyword. So when a unit has shock, the first time it attacks in a game, it does not take damage in return, regardless of what it's attacking. Doesn't matter if it's got ambush, it just doesn't take damage in return. But it then loses the shock keyword, so it only triggers once. So this thing kind of sort of has a shield on it. But even then, it's still not massively well statted to be a hugely competitive card. It does have an interesting deployment effect, which is reduce the operation cost on a friendly unit by 1, which is interesting. Like, anything with lowered op cost is never a bad thing, especially when you're starting to see heavier, bigger tanks, for example, coming into the game with bigger op costs. Even then, do I think we're going to see a huge amount of this? I really don't know. It depends on how good shock becomes and how people figure out a way to use it. I mean, there's some ways to look at it, but shock is a mechanic that is at its best in very specific instances, and as I say, I'm not sure that this card has the stats you'd want for it to be massively proliferate, but it's also not bad. It's not just bicycle spokes. It is a usable body. You might well see this in draft. I just don't know whether we'll see it in any major archetypes. Again, totally going to depend on whether shock becomes something that you sprinkle into a more frontline-y focused deck, or an archetype all to itself. But on the whole, it's a solid card. A card I do think we're probably going to see a bit of is 304 Panzergrenadier. Oh, how I am unsure whether I love or absolutely loathe this card's existence. Okay, so let's break this down, because you may well be looking at this going, this is a very, very generically statted standard card, and you're not wrong. But it has blitz, always important. That makes it a decent 4-drop. It also has a crazy good deployment effect, which is not that hard to trigger. This +2/+2 if the enemy HQ has taken damage this turn. If this drops as a 5/5, that's incredibly good value. This is kind of the German version of 5th Rangers, which rotated out ages and ages ago. This is just an immensely good value frontline card. It's just good value body. At its default stats, it's not terrible. If you can proc the deployment effect on it, it goes from not terrible, from reasonable to amazing. I would not be surprised to see a lot of mid-range decks running this, either with German main or as a German ally, especially given that you can run 4 of these in your deck. This is a very competitive card as a kind of a 4-drop, or even more likely perhaps a turn 5 drop, because you sort of want the operation cost available to make sure you pink the enemy's HQ, unless you have a free way of doing it with, I don't know, some form of 0 op cost tank. Panzer 35T. The sequencing on this is not rocket science. Early 1-drop infantry, Panzer 35T forward, possibly another unit into the front line. We're at turn 3, then on turn 4, Panzer 35T smacks the enemy HQ. This hits the board, pushes forwards as 5/5, and your opponent's in trouble. I like this card. I think this card is very good value. I'm kind of sort of sad that it's going into Germany, which was already in an incredibly strong place, and I'm not sure needs yet another insane value 1-drop infantry, but 4-drop infantry, I should say. But hey, it's interesting, and it's not egregious. It's just very good if you can trigger it. We'll wait and see how proliferate it becomes, but expect to see this card. Okay, Buzz Bomb. This card's insane. This card is so good in the right circumstances. This is directable damage to your opponent's HQ, potent in and of itself, only costs 1 credit, and draws you a card if you hit your enemy's HQ. Like, that's what you want to do with this. Expect to see this card see play. Now, there are some order counters and stuff out there at the moment, so this may not be super proliferate. I'm kind of glad this wasn't around before we saw some tempering of orders and burn, because I don't know, Germany-Japan diplomatic attaché, or Japan-Germany diplomatic attaché plus this. There are some cracked things you can do. Commandos, if Commandos comes back, loves this with German ally. I mean, really loves this with German ally. Deal damage to the enemy HQ, proc your commando triggers, and draw a card, which probably gives you another order to proc. You see where I'm going with this. This card has, in the right deck rather, this card is utterly cracked, even as a limited card. And even then, just if you want something that cantrips and pops some damage, it's pretty decent. But 1 point of damage, unless you're doing something very specific with it, is probably not super important. But I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see this card around a bit, because it's very good value for what it does. Self-cantrip and deal a point of damage that's targetable to the enemy HQ. I mean, you have to target the enemy HQ if you want the card, which I suppose is a limitation. This isn't bad. It's not utterly broken, but I personally think it's a teeny bit cracked. But only in specific decks. Okay. We've seen case yellow, now we get to see case blue. Oh, the unpacking. On the face of it, this elite is just a win more card, and not a particularly good one, if I'm honest, at 9 cost, and with the need to have enough high attack cards on the board under your control to actually make it worth the damage that it's going to do. Yes, it can do a lot of damage, but by that point you've got a bunch of high damage, probably incredibly good value infantry or tanks on the board, so you're probably already in a winning position. But credit acceleration exists. And while credit acceleration exists, and depending on whether we see anything done towards adjusting that with balance patching, this thing could be played much earlier. I mean, with Reichsbank, you could play this on turn 4. Now, the odds of you having a bunch of really good 4-attack units out are pretty small at that point, unless you've already been, playing other stuff. Kind of my point with this card is it has the potential to be insanely potent, because it could theoretically be 9 credits win the game. But if it's 9 credits win the game, you're probably sort of already in a winning position anyway. It just accelerates winning, and it's an elite, so you're digging for it, and having that many 4-attack units on the board. Well, there are the 4. I mean, obviously, this is designed to go into the 4-attack archetype, which is coming for Germany. We know this is the case, and this is going to be like a nice elite to throw in that deck. I'm not as worried by this as some people are, simply because without finding a way to find it consistently and get it out way ahead of curve, which is quite a bit of hoop jumping, considering you've also got to have the board presence to make it worth doing, it's a little clunky, and it might just be a win more card. However, I do remain cautious about this, because, as I noted, credit acceleration exists in this, as do a number of really good German mid-range units that do 4 attack or more is not as big as you think it is. Schutzen does this. The new infantry that we have literally just seen that goes from 33 to 55 also ticks this box. A bunch of the tanks tick this box. Playing Blitzkrieg makes everything on your board tick this box. That would be very expensive though. That's 12 credits. But there are ways that this could be exploited. And I imagine some people are going to try to do so. So expect to see that happen, I just don't know how good and consistent it's going to be. Right, Crossfire. New German order. I'm not sure what I make of this. I find this hard to evaluate, because it's really matchup dependent, which makes it a difficult thing to always be including. This thing absolutely obliterates early aggro decks, particularly classical style Japan aggro or pizza aggro even to a degree, because this thing does 1 damage to each enemy unit. As long as at least 1 enemy unit is destroyed, it repeats the effect, so it does 2 damage to every other enemy unit. This could be really good value for 4 credits, or this could be a complete waste of 4 credits. Because it's dependent on board state, it's dependent on your opponent having at least one defense unit, because if you can't get the second proc, this becomes even less worth playing, and it's quite expensive for what it does. Into certain decks, if we were in, for example, a Soviet tokens meta, this card would be cracked, because it would just destroy boards. But yeah, there are some things you can do with this, but on the whole, I don't know. I don't know how good it actually is, and I have to wait and see. And I'm going to be honest, sometimes I look at a card like this and I can see the theory behind it, but I'm not in internal testing, I've not seen this in play, and we've not seen this in a meta yet, so I don't know how proliferate this is going to become. I might be missing something, it might become utterly amazing, but as it stands at the moment, I'm not sure it's juice squeeze is the issue with this. It's super situational, which you're having to include in your deck, and even more matchup dependent. So, jury's out, but I'm mostly underwhelmed by Crossfire at the moment. Watch me be wrong. Okay, this is the big one. This is something that's been teased for a while. In 1939 have said for a while that at some point they were going to print a card for the largest, or heaviest I should say, tank ever made. And they did it. This is the Maus. Yes, that's German for mouse. Turns out, despite many other problems, the engineers and quantifiers of the German army were not without a sense of humour. For those who don't know the history, you could go Google it. This was theoretically a prototype. Only 2 of these, I think, were ever actually made, because despite being an utter beast with basically a naval gun on a tank, this was utterly impractical. It got stuck places, it moved really slowly, it broke bridges. There were many reasons this thing never saw actual active service. But this is cards, so we can play around with things like this, and good lord we did. I'm going to gloss over the artwork. Much has been said about it. Not going there. No, by the way, I don't like it. I'm not a fan of this art. Anyway, let's look at this for the unit that it is, and what a unit it is. First of all, this thing is the capstone of capstones. This is up there with the Super Fortress. It's a ridiculously expensive card with a ridiculous operation cost, but it has appropriately insane stats. This thing has heavy armor 3. The deployment effect: destroy all units with cost 3 or less, deal 2 damage to an enemy for each. So if you drop this, and there are enough units on the board, an enemy includes your opponent's HQ. There we go. Hypothetically, very strong. In practicality, who knows? Like, really, who knows? I mean, someone somewhere is going to run this and some bolster to turn this into a 16-14 with 0 op cost. For no other reason than they can. Is this really that good? I don't think so. It's kind of just another win more card. It does have the potential to massively swing a specific board state, because if it is a board state defined by kind of early game units, as in units with cost 3 or less... Oh, we're looking at you, Britair. This could clear the board and do quite a lot of damage to your enemy's HQ, and again, with credit acceleration, you're not necessarily having to wait until turn 12 to play this, which could also be a relevant part of it. But in the grand scheme of things, it's just another big, flashy elite, and most of the time I'd probably rather just drop Leopold. Personal thing, we'll see. We'll see if it becomes better than I think it is, and I'm sure, as I say, I'm absolutely certain that some people are going to play around trying to get this out and put bolster on it. Also, not for nothing, this can indeed be generated by Blitz Doctrine, so hypothetically you could end up with more than one of them. Just saying. Ironically, hypothetically, you could actually end up having more on, but someone at some point, actually, I might have to try this on stream at some point, just to see if I can engineer a deck so that I can have more of these on the board than whatever actually manufactured in the war. I mean, that's it, just for shiggles. But ultimately, this is a big-ass card that's big and flashy, and people are going to play around with it, but I don't think it's actually all that. There honestly are better German elites. To Japan, and opening up, by accident actually, with the card that I revealed this week. This is Duty Bound, and this card is just straight cracked. And get it out the way. I somehow landed... By the way, I don't choose the reveals I get given. I sometimes get a selection, but this was just given to me. And I ended up with... I got Blitz Doctrine... And now I got this. This is insane. So this is ludicrously good. This is the definition of a card that goes into your deck until such time, like 4 copies of it, until such time as you have a pressing reason to put something more important in. Because, yes, it takes up space, but the value on this is insane. 1 cost for +1/+1, as I have talked about before, isn't bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. 1 cost for +1/+1 that enables 1 cost for +2/+2, which then enables 1 cost for +3/+3 and 1 cost for +4/+4, is incredible value, especially for a nation which loves early aggro and could benefit hugely from buffing these units. Imagine, if you would, a situation in which your opponent drops a Type TK94, Type 94 early, onto the board, pushes it forward, smacks you in the face, gets the +1 to its attack, then next turn with your 2 credits you play Duty Bound, and then Duty Bound again, giving it +3/+3, and then smack your opponent in the face on turn 2. This card can enable insane high roll, and also it's just incredible value later in the game. Also, air, land and sea. You're not limited to 4 of these. There's no limit. Like, you can only put 4 of these in your deck, but there are ways to get more of them, and every one of them is exponential value. Well, technically it's linear value, but good value. Honestly, I think this card is utterly cracked. I think this card might just be too good, and I think this card will see a huge amount of play. I also think this is going to be an incredibly good card for newer players, because it gives you just a good standard rarity card to plug out your deck that is always going to do something decent. There are downsides. It takes up a space in your deck, it doesn't cantrip itself, So it does have the deck space, and I do talk about that in deck building theory and all of that stuff. That is relevant, but I'm not going to lie, I still think this card is insanely good. This is the Hirosaki Brigade. I love this card. I want to be clear, I love the idea behind this card. I've said before, I was looking forward to seeing if we got more smokescreen support, and we are. Hirosaki Brigade is decent value unit, yada yada yada. It has smokescreen, surprising no one, but it gets, when a friendly unit loses smokescreen, it gets +1/+1. That's really good. That's the heart of what smokescreen needs to do, and you can run 3 of them. Is it game breaking? No, but it allows a good, solid, pivotal card, like a pivotal limited card for smokescreen decks, and I love that because good limited and standard cards are what enable decent archetypes, and this is a good staple for that smokescreen deck. Like it a lot. It's aircraft time for Japan, and we get the Ki 30 An. This is an elite, and on the face of it, it doesn't really look like it. It's a very on-cost bomber with blitz. Stats aren't anything to write home about, but it does have, when this unit attacks, deal 2 damage to the enemy HQ. So, if nothing else, for those of you who have followed the removal of Shiden, this is kind of baby replacement. This is 4 cost to deal 4 damage to the enemy HQ. Because you can blitz it. Unless you find a way to buff it. It's nowhere near as good as Shiden was. Not even close. But it is a bomber, which means it can't be guard blocked. Which is not nothing. I think this card will see play in some Japan aggro decks. If only for the reach. Especially if they can find a way to buff it with some of the stuff that they see. Also, duty bound on this. Just a thought. But on the whole, I actually think this is decent. I don't know whether this is truly an elite. Is this more of a special? Maybe to me. It might get a buff at some point. If I were buffing it, how would I buff it? I might consider lowering its cost, or maybe giving it an extra point of defense. I don't know. But anyway, it's there or thereabouts. But actually, if you've got it, and you're running a Japan aggro deck and you just happen to have opened this, there's no reason not to put it in there because it's reach. And you could enable some really hilarious OTKs with this if you could find the buffs. Oh, I just had a whole thought about self-credit denial and air, land and sea, and then 1 roofing into this and a full set of multiple duty bound. Anyway. I'm not helping myself here. I just went off into a whole thing. And this is one of the things that this might enable, is some theory crafting. Because this is a little baby thing that's playable for not a lot of credit, that basically, without some kind of protection on your enemy's HQ, or your enemy running a fighter, has a really good reach on it. So, it's not terrible. It's not... I don't know how really, really good it is, but this is decent. It's not as bad as I think some people think it is. Right, Seek and Destroy. Now this is another one of those cards that's very hard to properly evaluate, because it depends on situation. This is, as an order, it's kind of similar actually in many respects to the US Grum and Goose, which is the covert card that when you reveal it, every time the enemy HQ takes damage on that turn, you draw a card. This just gives all of the units that are on the board at the time that you play it, after this unit attacks the enemy HQ, draw a card. Played at the right time, this could be really good. But it's very, very costly at 4 credits, and you want to see value out of it. You've got to ask, are you going to have the credits to do anything with the cards that you're drawing? Or are you just filling up your hand for next turn? Which is also a possibility. I mean, you could use this in a deck that throws its entire hand out over a couple of turns at 0 op cost, then you get one big refill turn empowered by this, and then follow the sequence through, which I kind of think is where this is going. I just don't know whether you're going to see a lot of it, given that expansion exists. I don't know. This is a wait-and-see card for me. This is going to depend on how much people end up valuing it. Because, you know, we're dealing with a community that at one point thought, you know... Anyway, there have been moments. Go look up some videos between me and JK. There have been moments where people like thought Empire of the Sun was really good draw value. So I might be wrong about this, but I look at this and I'm not sure that the value's there in a non-situational way. Could be good in self-credit denial, I guess, if you're feeling like you're not drawing enough cards, because you'll have the credits to spend it, but even then I think it's a stretch. I don't know, I have a horrible feeling this is just going to languish in obscurity. Colour me wrong in a bit. A card that probably isn't going to languish in obscurity is Shadow Strike. This is a really interesting standard order. So this gives a unit shock. As noted before, this is the keyword where unit doesn't take retaliation damage when it attacks and then uses the shock keyword, which lets it survive, and then at the end of the turn, assuming it's survived, it gets smokescreen. Now, in a smokescreen archetype, this could be amazing. If you can get a good blitz unit, again, I'll take my classic blitz unit example because it's the one that can go directly to face. The 94 early, you drop the 94 early, you run forward, you put shock on this, pop something, attack something, whatever, and give it smokescreen so that then you can trigger it with a buff. You can do this with other units, you can trade something, anything you want to trade. What this is really good for, by the way, is for trading, obviously. You play this before you trade, which gives you shock, which makes the trade free, and gives you smokescreen, which hypothetically then lets you get that unit more buffs through some of the smokescreen tools we're starting to see. Not for nothing do I think that if we do see smokescreen decks, this will probably be in them, because I think played well, this could be very good value. It's also a way of getting multiple ticks, because when your opponent, when a unit loses smokescreen, give it yada da yada da. This could trigger it multiple times because it loses smokescreen, does some damage, and then gets smokescreen back again, and then the next time it loses smokescreen, it gets the buff all over again. Again, expect to see this card tried to be worked into a smokescreen deck if we actually see a smokescreen deck, and honestly, we might. If nothing else, there's a decent chance you'll see me try and make one. It'll probably be terrible, but you might see me try and make one. But yeah, overall, I actually like the design of this. I think it's a decent value order. Might be too good value, depending on how much smokescreen support we get, but I like it. And I expect that it will probably see at least a little bit of play. So I only have one card on the board for the Soviet Union right now. But oh my, it's a card. This is Front Formation. This is a mighty 9-cost elite. Notably, I quite like the art on this. I know I've had the occasional bit where I've gone backwards and forwards. I actually think this is quite funky. Anyway, this is your HQ gets at the start of your turn, take 1 damage and add a T-34 1942, that's a 5/5 Blitz tank, to your support line, destroy it at the end of your turn. This prints T-34s infinitely while damaging your HQ. But that's okay, because there is a tank that you can put down that heals your HQ when you attack with a Soviet tank. Now, this is definitely a late game tool. The downside to this is straight up the cost. However, if you get to a position where you can trigger this onto an open board with the correct support, this is insane. However, you have to jump the hoops, which has been the perpetual issue with some of the big Soviet funky things that they can do. You've got to jump the hoops to make this work. I love this as a design. I personally would have liked to have seen it maybe a credit cheaper. Just I'm not an expert. Well, okay, so as people keep telling me, I sort of kind of am. But the point being, I'm not. The testing has happened, and waiting is waiting. But I am not sure that this is not at some point going to see an adjustment to its cost to bring it down to being playable on turn 8 rather than turn 9. Just a personal thing. Feels more like this would be a better swing on turn 8 than turn 9. I think turn 9 might be just a little bit too late for this. But anyway, we could get into all sorts of maths and theory behind it, and of course it's an elite, so you don't even know that you're going to see it. But on the whole, I actually quite like the design. If you're going down the T-34 route, this is a cool way of doing it, especially when you've released, as I say, a tank that sits on the board and says when you attack with a Soviet tank, your HQ gains HQ defense. Gains 2? I think it gains 2, but anyway, the point, I'd have to go look it up, and there's no need for that in this video, but I might pop the card. The point being that if you can get that on the board and then keep triggering these, it's an infinite cycle of 5/5 blitz tanks. Good luck. It's pretty butch. Is it going to be meta-defining? Probably not. But I could be wrong. But again, as I say, I think it's just that little bit too late to be meta-defining. But we shall see. It's certainly interesting, and it's certainly strong. So we did earlier this week see dev blogs for both the US and Germany, so both of those have seen a fair few cards, and this is the first of the US ones. This is First Cavalry Troop. First Cavalry Troop is going to land into the 3-op cost deck, and you'll see why in a moment. It's another disconcerting piece of art for me, the face on the motorist. I'm getting distracted by art right now. There's a focus to that. There might actually be a video in that somewhere. Anyway, so this is a pretty decent 2-drop for that 3-op cost deck, because this has when you deploy a unit at its operation cost as attack to this unit. So if you drop, this unit just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then of course you have things like Land of the Free that can turn this into a 0-op cost unit, or Bolster if you can afford it later on in the game, which would give this another +3/+3. This is a growing threat that can smack you about the face and neck. It doesn't buff its defense, thank the Lord, because that would be silly. But it's solid, and it's a threat that comes out early, and this is something that the 3-op cost deck is going to need if we're actually going to see it as an archetype that sees any degree of play. And the more I look at the cards that are becoming available, spoilers, there might be some more coming in a bit, the more I believe that we might actually see a very viable 3-op cost deck. It's not like Trips was bad. Sorry, Trips. I shouldn't call it. Trips is the name of the 3-op cost deck I have on my account that I like occasionally rolling out, because I played around with it and went, even though it's not amazingly strong, it's good fun. It gets a lot better when you start adding things like this in. This is a good value add, because it's something your opponent needs to do something with, and it's got just enough defense to be annoying. I like it. I really do. I think it'll be an integral part of the deck if we see it. Okay, the big red one. Kind of cool art, quite bleak, but interesting. Big unit. Huge. This is a big elite. With a very specific function. So, this thing is monstrous and slow, and also makes all cards in your hand cost 4 credits. Why on earth would you want cards in your hand to cost 4 credits? Well, that depends on what's in your hand and how expensive it is. I really don't know. This is a piece of a puzzle that I have as yet to figure out. There is something that this can probably enable. I mean, obviously, a Super Fortress for 4 is a good example. But you've got to get it out on turn 8, and it's so slow and lumbering. But I mean, again, if you hit this with Bolster... Just to be clear, if you can hit this with Bolster, and someone's gonna do it, it's 16/16 with 0-op cost. Sorry, 12/12, not 16/16, but still, it's 12/12 with 0-op cost as an infantry unit. If you hit it with Bolster, it's crazy. I don't know. I'm not sure where this fits. I'm unsold so far. But as I say, I have a feeling this is a piece of a puzzle that I just haven't seen yet. There's probably something utterly, utterly terrifying that this enables. But right now I'm kind of on, yeah, okay, sure. Right. The L4 Grasshopper. This one takes a little bit of breaking down because its value is very specific. So, yada 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 fighter, it's okay. Its stats aren't great. They're actually a little bit underwhelming, especially for a limited card. But your Sherman units cost 1 less to deploy and get blitz. Right, to be clear, Shermans, as far as I understand at the minute, are basically anything with the M designation. That seems to be the way we're going. We'll wait and see when it lands, but I think that's pretty much the case, because obviously we don't... Sherman isn't written on every... Anyway, you'll catch up when we see the release. But the deal with this is that this is potent. Reduced deployment cost is always good. Blitz on tanks is always strong, because obviously tanks can move and attack on the same turn, which means as long as you can afford to operate them, they're very potent. This is an enabler. This is a thing that if it sits on the board, as innocuous as it looks, if your opponent doesn't deal with it, its effect will kill you. Like, if you don't deal with this and you see this on the board and you don't do something about it, it's gonna kill you. The effect is gonna kill you because your opponent is running a bunch of Shermans and this is just making them cheap and fast. And you don't want them to be cheap and fast, you want them to be expensive and slow. Because that's the only thing that stops them being egregious, because they're generally speaking gonna be quite trusty. This is going to be a big part, an integral part of the Sherman deck if we see the Sherman deck. That's pretty much all I've got on it. We'll have to see how much more Sherman support we get and how it all plugs together when we have it in our grubby little paws, but this is going to be an important part of it. So expect to see at least some early play, and then we'll find out whether the deck's any good. By the way, I actually really like the design concept behind this. I think this is actually quite a well done enabling card. It's not egregious, it's not ridiculous, it's just a must answer. I like that. My kind of card. On the subject of Shermans, the M6, the big elite that we were expecting to see of the Sherman type. Heavy armor 2, not nothing. Decent stats, not super special, but good. And your HQ takes 1 less damage for each of your units with 4 or more attack, which in a Sherman deck is going to be a chunk. However, there's always going to be a however with me, the degree to which you care about that reduced damage is immensely situational. If you are currently trying to get over the line against an air deck or something with reach, you care a lot. This is immense. This is potentially game-winning. If, on the other hand, you're already in a good strong position in the front line, having out-traded your opponent with value in a new unit and board position focused meta, no one cares. And is the tank itself good enough to be effective? I mean, heavy armor 2's not nothing, but 3 op cost? We'll see. Again, like, it's a situational card, but then elite should be. In the right situation, this thing is freaking devastating. If you're playing Brit Air against this thing and it hits the board and you think you're in a good position, you're really not anymore, because you're going to struggle to get through the heavy armor to remove it, and you can't really deal damage to HQ, so honestly, it's situational but good, and I can live with situational but good. But it's not... I was kind of expecting something a bit more spectacular for the big, like the big Sherman show-off deck. I was expecting something louder, if I'm honest. Bit more flashy. Alright, I suppose it had to happen at some point. the women at work, obviously reference to the whole thing with the home front and all of that, and it's important to remember historical context and all of that with regards to kind of affirmative action and kind of understanding of the changing ethos. Iconic art, very well chosen, and I actually really like the effect of this card for the theme that needs representation because it was a big part of the war and the war effort, and I really like the way they've chosen to implement this. We'll get to whether I think it's good or not in a minute, but I like the design behind it. So this is a standard card that lets you choose a US unit in hand and reduce its cost by its operation cost. So to have any value, clearly it has to have a high enough operation cost to make it worth spending to reduce it by that, which means it needs an operation cost of at least 3. Shocking! Yes, once again, this is a card that goes into the 3 or above operation cost deck to give you some pseudo-acceleration. And I like it. Do I think it's going to see a huge amount of play? I don't know. I think people are probably going to want to lean heavier into just plain ramping to have more permanent credit reduced rather than including orders to do the job. But I kind of low-key hope it does see some play because I like the design of it. This is the way, by the way, 1939, if you're ever watching this, this is the way I would like you to actually continue to do credit acceleration if you really must do it in the game. This is a much more controlled and disciplined way to do it than, for example, Reichsbank or good old-fashioned ramp. Because this is controllable. It is an effect that you have to actually engage brain to figure out whether it has good enough value at the given time on the unit that you're targeting with it, and it makes you use a card in hand. However, there are things that I think would make this better. Truly and honestly, if you really wanted to see this see a lot of play, I would have it cantrip. I'm not kidding. You can explode in the comments at me, I'm sure some people will. But if you really wanted to see this be an integral card in the deck, I honestly think you could keep it as it is and let it cantrip, which is to say, draw a card. Just one to replace itself when you play it. And I think this would be much more appealing. As it is, I just don't know that it's going to make it, which is sad on multiple levels because of A, the artwork, which I think is cool, B, the effect, which I think is good design, and of course, critically, because of what it represents, which is an integral part of warfare, and I'm glad to see it being represented in the way that it is, in a way that is designed to work with a major archetype. Kudos for the thought process behind it. As it is, I'm just not sure it's good enough. It's good, just don't know if it's good enough, given the other tools that are currently available. However, we haven't seen a balance patch yet, so let's wait and see. So, we've arrived at Allied nations, and Italy standing alone amidst the Allied nations with its card this week, or at least the one that I've seen. If there's another one in this video, it's because it got edited in later. But currently we've seen, as I record this video, we have seen one Allied card this week, and it is Trento Division. I like this card because it's very Italy. Again, I'm not going to say that it's good. I'm going to start by saying that I like the idea behind it. So, once again, Italy falls into the category of having some good control tools, and I like that. I think it's something that has always been interesting. We saw it with the dagger strikes in the last swing. We're seeing it here. So Trento Division is incredibly expensive, not gonna lie. It's a really decent body. Not an amazing body, but it's a decent body for its cost. Might be a little bit weak for its cost, but the deployment effect is kinda strong. So, deployment. Destroy an enemy unit with 4 or more attack if you control another unit with 4 or more attack. So, obviously, it's a bit situational. But it's removal, and I don't mind that. So we've already seen similar Italian units deploy that do this. La Decima does something very similar. And I kind of like that as design, because this is sort of a super trade. You put it on the board, destroy something, and then you've got a body that's good for trading. This, of course, does not have guard, however. So it's a little weaker. But at the same time, it's not terrible. So this is much more situational. In direct comparison to La Decima, this is probably not as good, honestly. But it's another strong Italian control removal tool and a good body. Kind of sad that it doesn't have guard. That's kind of my thing. Although thematically I understand why the Trento division wouldn't have guard. That's a whole historical thing. But I don't know. Like, this card is again in that category of I just don't know if it's good enough. But I like the design space. And that's going to be interesting. I like that it's situational but strong. Because if you control a unit with 4 or more attack, other than this, you can basically remove any of your opponent's big threats, which is a nice thing to be able to do a couple of times a game. You get a decent body for it, and it's a decent body with 1 op cost, which is not nothing for a big body like this, by the way. You at least can put this on the offensive in a way that you can't do with certain other cards. But on the whole, I like it. I think it's a decent design space. Again, I'm not sure if it will actually see a huge amount of play. Guess we'll find out. But interesting card. So that's it. That is the cards that we've seen this week, and my opinions on them. I hope you find it useful. I hope you find it interesting. I certainly am intrigued at the moment. I think we're seeing... The more we see cards, and the more cards we are seeing in different directions, the more we're seeing the fleshing out of these new archetypes that we're seeing, and I like that. I think it's very interesting. I look forward to seeing your comments and views. Please, if you want to continue the conversation, do so either in the comments down below or join Discord, link in the doobly-doo. As always, you can click on all the stuff down below, like, follow, subscribe, support the channel if you can find the spare cash to do so. It's always appreciated. It just lets me make more of this and keep the quality up. I will be back because I'm expecting a balance patch, which will probably be my next video. We'll be talking about that balance patch. But on the whole, it's been pretty cool. As always, stay well, be good human beings, and I'll catch you next time.